a Q&A. Representative Provenzano, did we pass an education budget by April 1st as per statute?
We haven't. Representative Baldwin, have there been any education bills signed by the governor?
No, there haven't.
Teachers are on strike again this morning across Oklahoma to protest low wages and cuts in school funding. An estimated 36,000 teachers flooded the state capitol in Oklahoma City yesterday.
If you've been in Oklahoma the last several years and you pay attention at all to the news, pick up the newspaper or watch the evening news, you'll know that Oklahoma is at the bottom of a lot of lists, we don't want to be at the bottom of, whether it's anything from health metrics to education standards to just, crime and safety. There's a lot of things that Oklahoma is at the bottom of the list in.
Oklahoma ranks 49th in the nation in teacher salaries, according to the National Education Association. The average salary for a high school teacher is $42,460 a year. That's almost $18,000 less than the national average. Many teachers in Oklahoma say they have to take on one or more part-time jobs just to get by.
So 2018 was an election year, and in many races, the two-week teacher walkout that was held last spring really kind of shaped and what the candidates' platforms were. A lot of candidates come in talking about education, but the fact that you had thousands of teachers that had walked out of schools for 2 weeks to protest low school funding really just kind of, was the lens in which a lot of the races were looked through. You saw several teachers running for office, some got elected. You saw some candidates who opposed tax increases to fund teacher pay raises. They got ousted from office, even in some pretty conservative districts. So there seemed to be an appetite among the public to really invest more in public education.
We went from 9 educators to 26 or 27, one of the two. And so we see a huge difference in the legislation and the policies that are coming forth with them there. I mean, we couldn't be more excited.
Well, I was initially recruited by my then House member. He told me I should consider running for office because I'd done some political work. I thought about it, rejected the idea. I was happy teaching. Things got worse and worse in Oklahoma, of course, over the last decade. So finally I decided I had to do something. So I posted on Facebook, and that made me a candidate, as it happens now. And then I spent 3 years running, 2015 and 16, and then 2017 to 18. So I spent a lot of time in the last 4 years knocking doors.
So this last year, when the walkout happened, and the representative that whose seat I now hold made a comment on TV, on the news, that teachers were paid to teach, they need to be in the classroom.
Is there room on the table for more?
They were hired to teach. They need to be in the classroom.
I kind of realized at that point that there were probably a lot of representatives up at the Capitol that really were making decisions that they had no idea the repercussions. And so that was my sign that it was time for me to get into the House. And so I threw my hat in the ring. Nobody thought I could win. And it was really, kind of great, and still is, that every time I meet somebody new, they'll tell me, oh my gosh, thank you so much for beating him. Nobody thought that he could be beaten. And so it's pretty cool to know, that I truly was the underdog, and, and here I sit now.
As an administrator, one of the first positions I had to cut was a support staff member at my school. And every single year after that, since 2009, I've had to cut someone or something from our budget. And you see this gradual whittling away of the support systems that we have across the board in all of our agencies. And then, you have this turn of events where people become angry that we're not able to provide the services that we once did, and to the quality level. Well, what did you expect? And the teacher walkout sort of prompted me to say, okay, now it's time to level up that concern. And participated in that, and then determined that it was the best fit at this time to take a step to the next level.
To drive up here to the Capitol, or to drive by and see the Capitol, and you go, I'm going to be working there. That's kind of crazy to think that there's about 4 million people in the state of Oklahoma, and I'm one of 149 people that are getting to make decisions for the state. You know, that's kind of surreal to think about, you know, where that puts me.
I've lost an election before, and that was hard because you invest so much of yourself in this romantic notion that you're going to bring change by talking to the voters. And I've won elections before, and that was hard because it meant a change in my identity from the teacher and the campaigner to the person on the other side who actually has to make decisions.
Well, what you've seen over the last several years is that Oklahoma's funding for public schools has gone down. The reason is because the budget hasn't increased, but the number of students enrolled in public schools across the state has. And so that's the way that the state funds schools, is gives money to individual schools and districts based on the students that they have. You've really seen teachers talking about the decline in education funding and the challenge of having low salaries for really the last decade. But when you hear people talk about education funding cuts over the last decade, what they're really saying is that the amount of money going into the funding formula has not increased, but the number of students have. So when you divide it all out, the per pupil funding in Oklahoma has gone down over the last decade, and from 2008 to 2018, it was the biggest decline that we saw in the nation, and that was really the motivation for teachers who walked out last year and for those that ran for office this year.
The Oklahoma Education Association has a 3-year plan called Together We're Stronger, and over 3 years we've asked for $200 million into the funding formula. We've asked for a $10,000 raise for certified teachers, a $5,000 raise for our support staff, and a cost of living adjustment for our retirees.
Well, when I started teaching, I tended to have 110 students altogether in 5 classes that I taught. By last year I taught, I had 146 students in 6 separate classes. And I wasn't by far the worst case in Oklahoma, but I saw the gradual pressure building up against everything that we were trying to do. More students, fewer resources, old textbooks, more budget cuts. I saw too many of my colleagues leaving. When I started, I was working with a faculty that had served, many of them, a quarter century in education. When I left, something like half the faculty at my school had been there for fewer than 10 years. And once again, my school is a standout for teacher retention. It was just an indication of what's happening in the system as a whole, as teaching became less of a career and more of a gig.
So in 2015 is when the heaviest of the budget cuts came down, and I was working in Newcastle, which is my hometown, and the superintendent called us into, all of the teachers, into a meeting, and we went in and he started telling us how the budget cuts were going to affect our classrooms, the schools, the district, and some of the things that they were looking at having to do because of those budget cuts. So I went home that night, told my husband, I thought, you know what, I may be running for office in the near future. Right now it's not the time. I was working on my master's degree, and so I just told him, you know, whenever it's time, I'll know it.
The very last year that I was there, speaking specifically, I attempted to hire a teacher and was successful from Union Public Schools, and she was just a rock star, and I couldn't understand how they would let her go. And I said, well, you know, is there any questions you have of me? And she said, well, I just have one question. What's your average class size? And I told her, and she goes, I want the job. Let me know. Because her average class size coming from an urban school is about 50. You know, and I said, well, surely you have support staff in there somewhere. Nope, just she and those 50 children who were good kids, but at that point, that's not a true teaching environment for kids at that developmental level.
So we saw several teachers elected to the legislature this year, and you know, I think what's interesting and what I've observed is that, you know, some of them are on education committees, and early on in the session, bills are moving through committees. There's been some bills in education committees that have been passed through over the objection of teachers. Most of these teachers that have been elected are Democrats, and so they don't have the numbers to stop a bill in committee or on the floor. And so there have been some things that have gone through over the objection of teachers. That includes an expansion of school vouchers or education savings accounts and some other things like that. So on some policy issues, I don't know that the teachers' voices are really being heard on that matter.
I really wish that that more legislators would go to the people who know their background.
The ag guys say everybody who eats has a stake in agriculture. And in education, everybody's been to school, so everybody does believe in the value of education. But it also seems to me, I don't claim to be an expert in agriculture because I eat. But we do have a share of people who are experts in education because they have this or that experience in school.
Right. Or work with this or that lobbyist.
Yeah.
For example, I have a piece of legislation that's going to the floor hopefully sometime this week, and it's a public safety piece. And, you know, before I wrote that, I talked to the Sheriff's Department, I talked to the Sheriff's Association, I talked to other police departments, I talked to the CLEAT people, and even some officers before I wrote the legislation. And so, you know, I wouldn't dream of doing something like that without talking to the people that it affects. And so I wish that all legislators would do that.
So my thought is, why wouldn't we want more educators in the legislature? Because we're lifelong learners. We are multitaskers, and you know that education isn't the only issue at the state capitol. There are all these issues. So if you have somebody that is interested in different things, has a base knowledge of different things, science, math, you know, English, social studies, all of those issues, and is invested in learning and can work with multiple personalities, because think of it in a classroom. Every student comes with a different personality and a different need and a different background every day. So you have all of those constituents needing your time and your attention, and it's the same thing at the Capitol. And teachers are trained to be that type of person. So so that's exciting.
But I do think the election of some teachers has brought more of a focus on education, and it has given teachers a more prominent voice inside the Capitol. I mean, teachers found a prominent voice last year when they walked out for 2 weeks, and you saw tens of thousands of educators at the Capitol. That was hard to ignore, and that had an impact. It also has an impact when you can see teachers elected to office who are able to have a seat at the table, not just for votes, but when it comes to, you know, budget and policy negotiations, to be able to give debate on the floor, to be able to represent teachers. And so I do think that it has had an impact on the legislature. Now, is it going to result in more education funding? Is it going to result in more pro-public school policies being passed? It's really early to see, and so far it doesn't seem like there's been a huge shift on that, simply because, you know, despite the fact that a handful of teachers have been elected, they don't necessarily have the numbers to stand in the way of some of those issues. But yes, they have brought more attention to the teaching profession just by having a few elected this year.
I think what the 2018 election did was it brought a lot of people with education backgrounds into the legislature, but it's still early, and we're still finding our footing. I think we could change the dialogue about education and maybe start having that dialogue sooner in the legislative year in sessions to come. But right now, I'm not convinced that we've done enough to change the culture in Oklahoma City yet.
If you talk to some leaders, I know the Senate President Pro Tem, who's in his first year leading the Senate this year, he said, hey, the past several years there's been a deficit. This is the first year we've seen a surplus in a while. And he said, hey, some of my colleagues who've been in my shoes in the past will say a surplus is actually harder than a deficit. When you have a deficit, you just make cuts. When you have a surplus, everyone wants a piece of the pie, and then you have to decide how to give it up.
So while we're not necessarily a part of the budget conversation, we're freshmen, we're Democrats, but what we can do is speak up and speak often and speak to the media as often as possible and to our constituents as often as possible, because that's the indirect pressure that we can apply to the budget process.
But the reality is there are 27 of them in both houses. So it takes their energy and their being able to communicate with their colleagues to get anything done.
We have the best teachers around, and we know this because every other state around us comes to Oklahoma to recruit from our universities. We're very good at what we do. We just can't keep the teachers here.
If you're a teacher that lives in Oklahoma City, and you know that Texas' average pay is a few $1,000s higher on average than in Oklahoma, that doesn't sound like a lot. But when you look at some of the fast-growing districts in the Dallas suburbs and in North Texas, and you realize that, hey, they actually pay $30,000 more, that's where things really get complicated and really get challenging for Oklahoma. It's not so much Oklahoma competing with Arkansas and Colorado. It is, but it's about Oklahoma districts competing with the districts around Dallas and Northwest Arkansas and Southern Missouri and in the Kansas City area. And so it's statewide average is important, but you also have to look at what are the individual districts paying, because districts can pay more. In Oklahoma, most districts stay at the minimum level, but in other states, districts are able to pay quite a bit more, and so that's a big challenge.
Yeah. Your future belongs in a Fort Worth classroom is a billboard that's been hanging over our highways in Tulsa.
Right.
Time to tear those billboards down. Oklahoma should be leading the way out of a lot of the problems that our heartland experiences, and we should be teaching other states how to make a better model for our future.
Agreed.